My name is John Githongo. I am a publisher of The Elephant. And this evening, it is my pleasure and my honor to interview Professor Larry Diamond, a man of many achievements. I'll just go through some of them. He is Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, Senior Fellow of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, also at Stanford, Bass University Fellow in Undergraduate Education, and a former director of the Haas Center for Public Service, all at Stanford University. He is widely published and is the global authority on democracy. So it's a great honor to be able to meet you again. I spent 3 wonderful months in Stanford in 2015 with you, Larry, and very memorable, and sort of gave me an opportunity to reflect. But it's not every day I get an opportunity to interview one of the world's leading authorities on democracy, about democracy in the age of coronavirus, when we're both under lockdown. Yeah. And so I first want to start by asking Larry, how are you doing? I mean, how are you doing personally? How's the family? We're in lockdown. We read about what's going in the United States. It's a frightening, anxious time for all of us. How are you keeping?
So let me begin, John, by thanking you for having me and thanking you for the amazing work you continue to do, and just expressing my friendship, solidarity, and admiration for you and your colleagues and everything you do. We'll get to this later. We're facing a very serious and sobering challenge, not only in public health terms, but in political terms, in terms of the threat to our democracy in ways that we never imagined we would face in the United States. But they pale in comparison to what so many people around the world are facing. So we always have to put that in perspective. And I would say there's a parallel to that here, where I sit on the Stanford University campus in California. California, which is larger than New York, has only about 1/10 of the cases of New York City. And California is probably more than 10 times as large as Louisiana, but has basically the same number of reported COVID-19 cases.
Right.
And the reason why is that we started sheltering in place very early and very decisively, particularly here in the county where Stanford is, Santa Clara County, and you'll remember that location. Right. From your time here. The director of public health of Santa Clara County, I think, may have been the first public health official in the United States to declare a mandatory shelter in place. And she then, by her leadership, induced the entire Bay Area to do the same, the San Francisco Bay Area. And then once we did it, it wasn't very long before the governor of California did the same. And there's absolutely no doubt, if you look both at the comparative evidence within the United States and the lessons from around the world, that this remarkable public official and more generally our vigilant and fast-acting public health and political leaders in California saved many lives in California.
Yes.
By acting early and decisively. And as a result of that, I can say that I'm fine. All my colleagues are fine. Everyone you knew and became friendly with here on the Stanford campus, they are all fine. We've had a few cases of reported COVID infections among the Stanford staff and student body, but very, very few. My family is fine. My extended family in Los Angeles, I mean, thank the Lord, so far, we're all fine. I will say, John, I was following this very closely.
Okay.
And I could see what was coming. And I started sheltering in place and taking extended precautions before we were asked to do so by our public health officials.
So you've been in lockdown for how long?
A month.
A month.
A month.
Okay. Well, I mean, the entire world is awake to this now, and one gets a sense that we're in the middle of a pandemic that we shall describe in the future as there was a world before the coronavirus and the world after the coronavirus. Clearly, so I'm really glad and grateful to hear that you're keeping well. This moment poses a number of questions, Larry, and congratulations. I was trying to count the number of books you've written, and I got about 15 now. The latest one, Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency, just published last year. And congratulations.
Yeah, the paperback comes out this month.
Okay, great. I look forward to getting the paperback edition, and when I'm in the States, perhaps I can get an autographed copy. And thank you for your work, Larry. I mean, it's you've been engaged around the same difficult area for a very long time, and I mean, you mentioned it, and so slightly at the start of this interview, and perhaps I'll jump straight into it. When we spent some time together, that's about 5 years ago now. In 2015, we were talking about that the world was in a democratic recession, really from around 2006. And you had studied this, and all the signs were there. And when you look at the different reports and research that are published in its regard, Freedom House and others, clearly, the world seems to be taking a step back into a more authoritarian model of governance. And the question I wanted to ask was, what's the condition of liberal democracy? Has what you described as a democratic recession, starting from around 2006, and by the time we met in 2015, you were quite deeply concerned about what was happening. Here we are in 2020. What's the condition of liberal democracy today? Has the recession become a depression? And what do we do about it?
Well, thank you, John. It's not a depression yet, but it is definitely a deepening recession. And when you consider that one of the most common motives of political leaders, whether democratically elected or not, is to enlarge their power and to free themselves of constraints on their power.
Right.
The crisis certainly gives new opportunities and excuses for leaders to seize larger powers. So I'll come to that in a minute, but let's go back in time. Beginning around 2006, we began to observe, as I show in my book, Ill Winds, a cessation of democratic progress in the world. If you look at the trends in terms of the number of democracies in the world and the trends in terms of freedom in the world, you can see a flattening of the curve in terms of democratic progress, and then the beginning of erosion of freedom, political rights, civil liberties, issues you care about like transparency and the rule of law. All of these measures were beginning gradually to recede around 2007, 2008. And then the financial crisis came and hit the United States and spread around the world. And the shocks of economic recession, of overextension of U.S. Military might in Afghanistan and Iraq, the failure of the intervention in Iraq, and I think it's been a failure, and the gradual retreat of Europe and the United States from the task, the imperative of democracy promotion and democracy defense, coinciding with the rise of China as a world power and the resurgence of Russia and its malevolent activities. These have all created new spaces and new opportunities for autocratically minded rulers in the world to seize power or enlarge their power. And you can see then what's been happening in many places has been usually not a military coup, though we've had a few of those, but a gradual suffocation of liberty, of judicial independence, of media pluralism, of rights of individual criticism, of internet freedom, of checks and balances. And this can proceed to the point incrementally where you wake up one day and you realize you don't have a democracy at all anymore. And that has happened in Turkey, it's happened in Hungary, I think it's happened now in the Philippines, it happened in Zambia, it's happened now in Benin, in Senegal. The president locked up his two most serious potential challengers and kept them from running for president. So we have an accelerating trend of democratic decline. When you say liberal democracy, well, the quality of democracy in liberal democracies was already receding over an extended period of time in some established liberal democracies, like the United States and Israel, most notably. And that's continuing. And now with the COVID crisis, you have new threats as well. And the effort of illiberal populists like the ruling party in Poland, I've mentioned Hungary, to extend their powers. So we definitely have, to summarize, an accelerating trend of diminishing democracy, declining liberal democracy, and declining freedom in the world.
Give me an idea. I mean, as I said, Larry, we followed what's happening in the United States quite closely. Kenya being a former British colony, we're following what's happening in Europe and Brexit quite closely. And clearly, so something's come unstuck. Something's going wrong in the countries that have been historically the templates for the current sort of global model of liberal democracy. What has happened in the United States? I mean, what's happened in the Democrat and the Republican parties? That it's as if, I mean, when from the outside, something seems stuck in what historically has been the most dynamic democracy in the world.
Well, I wish we were even stuck. The problem is we're in a downward spiral. And a leading indicator of that is political polarization and growing intolerance and growing unwillingness to listen to the other side and to listen to the facts and scientific evidence, and the populist tendency to dismiss any news you don't like as fake news or to wish away scientific warnings. And of course, we now have this remarkable story published in the Washington Post today, April 6th, if people want to look it up, that documents 70 days of denial of warnings on the part of President Trump, of scientific evidence and intelligence warnings that this was coming. And we were facing a pandemic that was headed to our shores and was going to require massive preparation and mobilization, which of course he wished away and denied, as he's been denying climate change and so much else in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence. So I think part of the problem in the United States is that we have had a 20-year trend of deepening political polarization that has been accelerated by first talk radio and the polarizing media entrepreneurs who feed on this kind of polarization and mobilization of anger, the very opposite of what you're trying to do with your media effort, John.
Yeah.
And we've had an exacerbation of the polarization by the trends in our electoral system, which is similar to yours. We're both of our countries are former British colonies, John.
That is true.
And we both inherited the system of what we call first past the post, the single member district electoral system. And when you've got two parties, and again, I think there's a parallel here in Kenya, banging at each other's heads in single member districts, it's kind of a winner take all, zero sum approach. So some of us have been advocating for ranked choice voting or instant runoff, where you can have more alternatives and people can vote for a third alternative or an independent, and they don't have to worry in the first past the post process that they'll waste their vote and allow the candidate or party that they like the least to win by not voting for the other polarizing alternative. Under ranked choice voting, if you if you vote for a third alternative or an independent and they don't make it and nobody gets a majority of first preference votes, your vote is transferred to your second choice. And those transfers keep happening in instant runoffs until somebody wins. So if we could get rid of this version of first past the post and institute ranked choice voting or maybe proportional representation using ranked choice voting, multi-member districts, if we could get rid of partisan drawing of electoral district boundaries and have completely nonpartisan drawing of district boundaries, if we could have more neutral electoral administration in the United States, and if we could try and reduce the fever pitch on the media, and as public figures and public intellectuals choose our words more carefully and with less personal invective, I think we could reduce these levels of polarization. But right now, and we have to some extent, we did get nearly unanimous vote in the United States to pass our economic relief package. And I think the scope of the crisis has sobered people up. But John, political leadership is very important. Mm-hmm. And when you have an illiberal, populist political leader in the presidency with authoritarian tendencies and contempt for the facts, contempt for science, contempt for the opposition, contempt for the mass media, and a kind of delusion of grandeur about his own knowledge and infallibility, it's a pretty dangerous situation for democracy in any circumstance, and it's triply dangerous in the kind of crisis we're in now.
Thanks, Larry. I'll come back to the US a little later, especially with regard to relations with Europe and other actors like Russia and China and the elections. But I just want to maybe just probe a little bit, because what you're suggesting is one of the solutions is this rank voting, which I've read that you've been advocating, and I've also watched a podcast with you advocating it. And of course, around the world, I think progressive people of goodwill are all asking the same questions of how do we improve the quality of our elections? How do we protect our institutions of managing elections? Now, when we spent time together in 2015, we talked about companies like Cambridge Analytica, which had been active in Kenya during the 2013 elections, in the Nigerian elections in 2015, that took place while actually I think when I was in the US, and what I wanted to ask is, there's been a major move around the world to use technology as something that helps to guarantee the quality of and the integrity of election processes. Our experience here in Kenya has been rather the opposite. It comes back to something that I've heard you say, that that the choices that political actors make in challenging times are critical to democracy. And one of the lessons that we've learned here is that you can't digitize integrity. That in fact you get mesmerized by technology, and Kenya had one of the most expensive elections in the world per voter, I think, at $25 per voter, 2017, 3 years ago. And but we also found they're easy to manipulate, especially at the tallying level. They're easy to be interfered with. Now, this is experience that the United States has also had, and this also speaks to your latest book about the role of Russia in the American elections. Now, you're going into elections in November, and so I just wanted to maybe combine those two questions. Number one, I feel we've been mesmerized for some time about the role of technology in elections, and perhaps forgotten that actually ultimately you need good people to manage it. And even if the voting is being done under trees with people scribbling on pieces of paper, if people trust the system and it's being managed by honest people, it's better than an expensive computer system that doesn't work or is being manipulated. But it seems from where I'm sitting in Nairobi, a pretty sophisticated manipulation of the US election in 2016. What's to stop it happening again in November, especially given the huge disruption that's underway right now with this coronavirus, which has frozen everything for a while?
Well, John, thank you. It's obviously the most urgent question that American democracy is facing now, since we are going to have a national election on November 3rd, 2016, as they say in Arabic, inshallah, God willing. And if we don't get this right, it could be a disaster. So we need to separate the challenges we face in terms of technology into two phases or two aspects. One is the campaign, and the other is the election itself, the election administration, the voting and the counting. So let me come first to the campaign. Yes, Russia intervened through a variety of digital mechanisms to influence the 2016 US election very clearly for two purposes, and it succeeded in both. One was to sow confusion, division, and the deepening of polarization in the United States. In some cases, feeding and using its trolls and the Internet Research Agency to support putative, but of course fake, radical Black American websites and commentators and rallies and so on. And at the same time to support white nationalist racist tweets and conversations online and so on. And of course, it did its utmost to create literally fake news, disinformation, and the very fine Cambridge Analytica style targeting, because targeting is what this is all about, of social media messages to try and discredit Hillary Clinton and elect Donald Trump. And then it stole a variety of documents online and released them in a carefully timed fashion to try and damage Hillary Clinton's campaign and to divert attention from some of Donald Trump's scandals at critical moments in the campaign and to shift the momentum. And I actually think the latter effort that the Internet Research Agency and the whole kind of Kremlin machinery of digital intervention in politics did was more important than the social media interventions themselves. The stealing of documents and the release of them using Julian Assange as an instrument for their malicious conduct in our campaign. So you've got all of that happening again. And now China getting in the game as well in terms of disinformation in a variety of ways, spreading the lie, for example, that the coronavirus was hatched in some US military laboratory or something, when we know it began in Wuhan, where there are biological laboratories, by the way. So if it wasn't initiated in a wet market in Wuhan, and it did emerge from a biological laboratory, it would have been a Chinese government laboratory and not a wet market or a U.S. Government laboratory. But we don't know that. I'm just saying that's the level of cynical disinformation that China is engaged in now as well. We have to fight this disinformation in a variety of ways, by educating people about what disinformation looks like, by having our social media companies tag and label and downgrade untrustworthy information and obviously false information, and by immediately labeling the source of all internet ads, and having the Facebook in particular, but all social media companies disclose who is paying for an ad and what kind of targeting they're engaging in. I think this is absolutely critical. I think we should mandate it by law. We've had a bill pending in Congress called the Honest Ads Act that some people in the Congress have been pushing and others have been resisting. But we've got to do more on the digital intervention and digital mischief, digital disinformation, and digital manipulation side of campaigns. And as you would understand so well, John, your entire professional life has been about this. Transparency is the key.
That's right.
It's not the only thing, but it's an absolute prerequisite to fighting this kind of mischief. So that's on the campaign side. Then we have the electoral administration side, the voting and the vote counting. And here, we face a perverse problem in the United States that results from our being a very old democracy, and one that doesn't always meet international best practices of institutional design. As you know from having spent time in the United States, elections are not nationally administered. They're administered in the 50 states and in the individual counties. The county administrators are generally nonpartisan civil servants, but the chief electoral officers of the states who set policy in the states are partisan officials in 37 of the states or so, I think they're elected as partisan officials. So they don't always behave in neutral and nonpartisan ways. And in some cases, particularly in Republican states, they have been engaged in practices and decisions that I think one can only conclude have the purpose of trying to suppress the vote of minority voters, that is, ethnic and racial minority voters, who they fear would disproportionately vote for the other party. It's a contemptible and undemocratic process that we've been trying to fight. We need reform in the United States to ensure that electoral administration becomes a completely nonpartisan and professional exercise, even up to the level of the chief electoral officer of each of our 50 states. Beyond that, we now face a challenge of voting in the age of coronavirus.
Correct.
And how do you do that when we have a pandemic that's going on now, will probably abate during the summer as we get control of the virus, but you know, all the experts expect will surge back in the fall. So we're going to have to expand means for voters to vote remotely.
Okay.
And in the United States, the natural way to do that is to vote by mail. You send out a ballot to each individual who's registered to their address, and it's a simple ballot. They mark it with a pen, and then the counting can happen rapidly because it can be optically scanned, and they can then mail it back in an envelope that requires no postage. It's paid postage by the government. Or they can drop it off on election day at a counting station, or if they want the experience of going to vote in person, they can go to a central polling station to cast their ballot on election day, or maybe 2 to 3 or 4 weeks in advance. But anyway, vote by mail is the key here. We have 5 states now, 1 Republican state, 2 or 3 Democratic states, 1 kind of purple state that's in between, Colorado, that are now going to be voting in November exclusively by mail ballot. Other states like California allow anybody to request a mail ballot if they want one. No excuses, no need to say why. Obviously, we know now why people would want it. And we need to move urgently to enable all states to vote either exclusively or at least by anyone who wants by mail ballot. States need money to adapt their ballots and their counting procedures to enable this.
Yes.
Experts estimate that it will require about $2 billion in investment to make the switch to these fairly simple mechanisms for balloting and vote counting. The Congress has, in its relief package, appropriated $400 million, but the Republican leader balked at appropriating the full amount that was needed. So hopefully the Democrats will be able to insist on the appropriation of the rest of the money in some of the future legislation that will be coming before the Congress. And I want to close, John, by saying that there's one technological innovation that we have to resist at all costs. And that most, if not all, computer scientists, knowing the vulnerabilities of computerized systems, strongly warn against, including the organization that I'm a member of called Verified Voting, which is an organization mainly of computer scientists. Anyone can Google Verified Voting and get to their website. And as they warn, you know, any system of internet voting can be hacked into by sophisticated actors like the Russians or the Chinese or some other malevolent criminal or ill-motivated groups. And it's a very, very great risk for democracy to vote online. It shouldn't be done in any election of consequence anywhere in the world. If you want to vote, for your board of your social club over the internet, that's one thing. The risk of hacking is, the consequences are not great, and the risk that anyone would care enough with the resources they would have to do it is not great. But for a major public office, no way. So that's something we have to avoid.
That's very interesting. So it's in a sense a word of caution about digitization as a panacea for in terms of the quality of development. Maybe just wanted to explore a little more comments that you've made in your book and that you've made in public statements over the past 9 months, in particular, vis-a-vis the role of China. That China is no longer a rising power; it is a risen power. It's a superpower now, which has got implications in from our part of the world. China, we've had this eastern side of Africa has had a relationship with China, India, etc., for 700 years, and so in a sense, it's an old relationship that is being reawakened now. The model of governance in China is very different from the one that we've been working towards implementing in Kenya, and people like myself are very much committed to. But China is considered an ally by most African leaders. At the same time, and this is now in very stark contrast as a result of the coronavirus pandemic that the world is in the middle of, the geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China, and also Russia doesn't have the same kind of economic heft, but is punching way above its weight geopolitically through a vast bag of tricks and tremendous determination. So the world has changed. And was going to change, and that this has been accelerated and complicated by the coronavirus. How does it's a question? How does, coming out of this pandemic, how does the United States regain the kind of moral authority it had at that moment when the Berlin Wall fell? And all of a sudden people thought, wow, okay, this is a very interesting moment. And you started your, and I'll end with that question later. You started your academic research in Africa, around Nigeria. And this caused sort of a convulsion of excitement around the world. Whole range of countries adopted multi-party democracy. Political opponents who languished in prison were released. Multi-partyism was legalized. Newspapers were started. We went from 1 or 2 radio stations in Kenya to I can't even count them now. So great freedom. This model feels to be under challenge at the global level. It's wobbling. It's wobbling partly because its most powerful proponent and example, the United States, seems to be having difficulty with it. But also because, as you mentioned earlier, the invasion of Iraq caused a lot of concern, I think, in many developing countries, not only Iraq, but Larry, the manner in which Muammar Gaddafi died, the former Libyan dictator. Now, he had no pretensions of being a Democrat, even back, But on the continent of Africa, he's somebody who supported quite a number of important liberation movements, and he had his own slightly kooky way of looking at things. But the manner in which the West was seen as having intervened in Libya really terrified autocrats and would-be autocrats across the developing world. One reads of Vladimir Putin has never been so upset across Africa. Leaders watch that, and there was a sort of coming together saying, hold on, this is not going to happen. So how does the US repair that beyond, fixing the election system so that once again it's working, and this kind of polarized kind of situation where it's extremes both on the left and the right, which don't seem, there seems to be a huge silent middle. How does the US fix that, or has its moment passed as the propaganda is being pushed out?
Well, let me first, John, say a few words about China, and then I'll say a few words about the US coming back. My advice to people and governments in Africa is not to race uncritically into the arms of Europe and the United States. That wouldn't be a credible appeal in this day and age, or to just become dependents of the West all over again. My advice is diversify your ties and don't become the captive or pawn of anybody. Mm-hmm. In the words of hearkening back to the Russian phrase in the arms control area of Reagan and Gorbachev, trust but verify, with an emphasis on the verification. And be wary of powers from the outside coming in with promises and gifts that seem too good to be true. You don't have to research very hard to find out what China is up to and the game it's playing and the way it's corrupting leaders and ruling parties all over the continent, and the quality of some of the infrastructure it's building and the gifts it's giving, and the nefarious ways it's penetrating into the media and the propaganda it's peddling, the lies, the disinformation, the corruption of journalists and politicians and so on. You don't have to be the world's best investigative journalist to discover this and expose this. When you expose this, the answer then has to be, I think, not, therefore we want nothing to do with you, China, but rather we want transparency again. We want openness, and we want you to stop interfering in our politics. And don't think if you're going to give us aid that you're going to take control of our port or our natural resources for the next 20, 50, or 99 years in exchange for it. We're not going to sell ourselves to a second colonial era all over again just because of the lure of temporary money or the embrace of some kind of pseudo non-Western friendship. So eyes open in all of these relationships, and radical transparency is the key. And that is not happening now in terms of Africa's relations with the People's Republic of China. And the reason, of course, is because many African leaders who are either autocrats or, I'd say, pseudo-democrats, and I would include your president in that category, or democratically elected officials who are kind of seeing the advantages in a variety of ways of Chinese investment and Chinese solidarity and Chinese gifts of various kinds. And I'll put gifts in very, very thick quotation marks. And this includes the leadership now of one of the most, still one of the most democratic countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana. They all, see the advantages to them politically of the non-transparent, under the table relationships, financially and otherwise, that flow from the People's Republic of China. And the only antidote to this, I think really the only antidote to this, is for civil society, the mass media, public intellectuals like yourself to stand up and say, not anti-China, 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 but we must have transparency in all relationships and diversification of our relationships, and not run the risk of a new dependence without any transparency on the neo-totalitarian leadership of the People's Republic of China. And that means Chinese technology too, which runs the risk of massive surveillance and compromise of individual and civic freedom, and the sharing of this data with authoritarian governments, or the compromise of national sovereignty. And people, Africans all over the continent, should be asking very carefully, what happens when Huawei comes in and builds our internet infrastructure or our 5G technology? What happens when the People's Republic of China builds the headquarters of the African Union and then insists on running all of the telecommunications, securing their, quote, maintenance in facilities in the African Union headquarters that Africans themselves aren't allowed into? What happens then to the supposed passion of Africans for independence and sovereignty, and not sacrificing all over again their hard-won liberation? People aren't asking those questions enough right now, and independent journalists really need to embark upon a whole new generation of independent-minded, resourceful, investigative journalism. So that's on the China side. On the US side, in terms of what we need to do, I'd say it's several things. First and foremost, we're not going to have credibility as a world power and a world player again until we get our own house in order. And that means we must get control of this virus. And that means we've got to have effective policies, more effective than are coming out of this president right now, in order to turn the corner as rapidly as possible. I want to say to any human being that might be listening to your broadcast, we know what works to control this pandemic, and it's shelter in place and limiting physical human contact, which is why I say the need is not for social distancing. John, I embrace you socially now. It's great to hear your voice and see your smiling face, but we're physically distant.
Yeah.
If we're not physically connected, the virus can't jump from you to me or vice versa, or from any other human being to another. So be patient and give the virus time to die out through physical distancing, and space out the medical cases that we're going to have so that our medical care facilities are not overwhelmed. Once that happens, I believe there are analogies now to the United States today and the United States in the 30s and at the dawn of World War II. I know, not for a fact, but through simple logical deduction, that the Chinese leadership, the Kremlin leadership, the Iranian leadership, and most other autocrats in the world must be delighted to see the United States writhing right now in this level of crisis and preoccupation. But I would say to them, I would say to your listeners, look at what happened in the 1930s after Hitler invaded Poland and France and started bombing Britain and threatening the world. This is before 2 years later, Japan bombed the United States in Pearl Harbor. Look at what happened. The United States rose up and became, in Franklin Roosevelt's immortal words, the arsenal of democracy. And we started producing guns and bombers and tanks and other equipment for Britain in the battle against Nazi Germany. And then, of course, our factories were working already at a very accelerated pace when Japan bombed, and we went into a full-time wartime mode for defense production. And I think you will see the U.S. going through a very difficult period, but rallying to the challenge. And eventually, we're already seeing it now, mobilizing on the production front for the medical supplies we need. Everything from masks and gowns to ventilators, respirators, and other protective and treatment equipment. Mobilizing on the biomedical front for pharmaceutical treatments, for the discovery of a vaccine. We're already seeing extraordinary innovations in Israel for the production, the discovery and production of vaccines and treatments, with Israel being another biomedical leader in innovation in the world. And I think you will see democracies like this becoming the arsenal of the world for the fight against the pandemic. And the U.S. Can be polarized, the U.S. can be inward-looking, the U.S. can be miserly at times and short-sighted. But, you know, I think COVID-19 will discover, I think the Chinese will discover, I think Vladimir Putin will discover, when you threaten, anger, and stir this massive, diverse giant, this most pluralistic and technologically advanced country in the world, beware, because ultimately we will produce and engage on a fearsome scale. And I would note here, not entirely happily, but I think rather trenchantly, with the wit and wisdom that only Winston Churchill was capable of summoning, another famous phrase of Churchill. Of course, you know the famous one, that democracy is the worst system ever invented by man, except for all the other systems that have been tried from time to time. But Churchill had another phrase that I think is very, very apropos historically, and particularly apropos at the moment. And it was this: you can always count on the United States to do the right thing after it has exhausted all the other alternatives.
On that happy note, Larry, you know, as always, you know, an inspiration and an honor to speak to you and to learn from you. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah.
Time and for engaging with our little platform, the Elephant, said, one of the things that the COVID virus has done is make these kind of engagements possible. And I think it's important to listen to voices around the world, and yours especially, given your tremendous leadership in studying democracy for decades. So I would say, please stay well, stay safe. Please give my warmest greetings to all my friends and colleagues that I interacted with at the Haas Center. And I wish you all the very best, and hope we're able to meet and shake hands properly, not just virtually, in the not too distant future.
We will do it, John. Be hopeful. We will get past this.
We are hopeful. Professor Larry Diamond at Stanford University, a great man, a great pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, John. Great to be with you.
Thank you.